Now, another talk to be delivered by the keynote speaker, Mr. Gilles Gravier, Director and Senior Advisor Open Source, Blockchain, Wipro Limited. The title of the talk is Choosing an Open Source License and Business Model for the Success of Your Project. If you'd like, Mr. Gilles, you can take it with you.
Yeah.
Whatever you prefer.
I guess I'll leave the microphone here because if I take it in my hands, I'm going to be walking all over the place and it's going to make everybody sleepy and tired. So, actually, no, I'll take it and I hope I don't move too much. All right, that way I can look at my slides. People have asked me over and over and over again, even though this should be a question long gone now, how do I make money with open source? And in particular, when it's a startup that's looking at creating a project and hopefully getting it funded, how do I convince an investor that my project is actually going to bring them money when they invest in it? So we're going to look here at how to use open source to, first of all, make a project that works well in terms of interacting with your community, and also how to select a business model that works well for open source. I will first start by dispelling a myth. People often talk about open source business models. I would like to say that there are no open source business models. There's business models, and then there are open source projects. Some business models are better suited for open source projects, others not. But a project is a project. Regardless of how you develop your software, or your drink, or your house, or your car, whether it's open source or not doesn't really change your business model. Okay? If you decide to make a proprietary software and sell support, you could just do the same thing with an open source software. So, first of all, we're going to look at licenses, because licenses is what's going to define the way people can interact with your code, and in particular, developers who are going to use your code in your software. So, if you look at the definition, sort of definition of what an open source license is, an open source license is something that gives you permission in advance. I've read this sentence yesterday as well, but I want it very much in your mind. It gives you permission in advance to innovate via using, studying, improving, and sharing code. So that's the freedom or the liberties that an open source license brings. But an open source license also defines, as a developer, the obligations I may have in terms of sharing my development based on that source code. So the open source initiative, I'm not going to talk free software, has defined a set of rules or characteristics that define an open source license. As you can see from here, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read them all, but they're really focused on allowing somebody who is using your code to do basically what they want with it in a very clearly stated way. And if you look at this, it seems that it is giving you permission to do things, but it's also imposing things, right? If it's saying that what I'm using in terms of open source software and then redistributing must allow the integrity of the author's source code, this means that if I'm using your software and I'm redistributing it to somebody else, I must make that somebody else aware of the original code, and in some cases, I must make the original software, the user aware of what I've changed in the code, and in some cases, what I've added in the code. So we're going to look at licenses in terms of these categories. I said I must make the user aware of the original code, what I changed, and what I added. Well, there are three different categories of licenses. When you use open source software or you create open source software, you're going to select, if you're creating it, a license. And that license is going to impose some things on what people do with your software. We talk about copyleft licenses, and those copyleft licenses are the licenses that would impose you to share the code that you're adding to an existing project. And if you start from the left here, The licenses that have no copyleft are the licenses that don't impose sharing anything you've added or changed. So a typical example will be the BSD license. If you use software that is BSD licensed and you change or add things to it, you do not have to tell anybody what you changed or added. You have to give them the original source code or tell them where to get it, and you have to tell them who wrote it. And as all licenses, you have to tell them what the license is. This is typically the Apple way of doing things. Apple has built their operating system on a BSD Linux, right? That Linux is open source. Everything else Apple has done to it and over it is Apple's intellectual property. These licenses encourage people to use the stuff, but doesn't encourage them to contribute. They contribute if they feel like it. So the BSD community is a growing community of people who are contributing because they think it's the right thing to do. And people like Apple think that their approach of making proprietary software is, for them, the right thing to do. The community people might not agree, but it lets people do it this way, and that's part of the game. That's part of the rules for the BSD license. Another type of license is the weak copyleft, or I call them file-level copyleft, reciprocal licenses. With one of these licenses, and I have example here like the Mozilla license or the LGPL, these licenses mean that if you use my project in your project, and you change anything in my project, for example, you fix a bug in a file, that change must be contributed back to the community. So you must send back to the group by making it available what you changed. But you can add anything on top of that and build a proprietary system on top of it. Everything you add can be proprietary, doesn't have to, but it can be proprietary. But everything original and everything you have changed, so just the files, the original files that have changed, you must make that source code available so people know what you changed. So this is interesting because it helps people enhance the quality of the original code, but it doesn't let people, it doesn't force people to grow the code. It just helps enhance the quality, and it also encourages or helps people who want to develop proprietary software on top of open source software. For example, somebody who's going to make a printer and doesn't necessarily want to share the code of their PCL or PostScript interpreter because that's proprietary knowledge, but want to use an open source operating system at the core and are ready to help the development of that software. So those are the weak copyleft. And then all the way at the right is the strong copyleft licenses, and those are the licenses like the GPL license, which is the license of the Linux world in particular. These licenses enforce that if you're using a piece of software, my software for example, and you change something in it, like the weak copyleft, you have to give to the community by making it available those changes. But more importantly, if you add anything on top of it in a certain way, if you link it or bundle it, that also needs to be open source. And this is interesting because it really fosters the development of extensions and the growth of an existing project. So for example, if you build a device based on a Linux kernel, inside that device, all the software that is bundled into it must come with a similar type of license as some router vendors like Linksys discovered when they first did their routers and were forced by the community to contribute all of the source code to the community. It's a tough story. Come and ask me about it later because for the sake of time, I'm not going to cover it here. And by the way, these licenses, the strong copyleft, they're also called viral licenses because they contaminate the rest of the source code, right? If you bundle something with Linux, your source code suddenly has to be with the same license as Linux or a compatible license. So it's kind of a contamination of your source code if you want. And you have to be really careful because if you bundle stuff that isn't yours, that stuff might have to be turned open source. Linksys had that issue with some of their drivers which were not open source but bundled in the routers. They had to publish the source code. Long story, tough story, but ended well. So once you've decided for your license, and that's important, again, because it defines how your community is going to interact with your code, the community of developers, the community of users who want to contribute, then you have to think, how am I going to make money? How am I going to make money with something that is ultimately free to use because anybody can download it? So there's two ways to consider, well, four ways, sorry, to consider making money with open source. The first is by building open source software. So you're building software that is open source, okay? And you'll have to find a way to monetize that software. Another way is to build with open source, meaning you're using open source components and you're building something that it might not be open source, like Apple and Mac OS. Another one is to build something for the open source world. So maybe a development environment or something that actually helps the open source people do their stuff. And finally is building all of your business on top of open source. You create a business that relies on open source. You're selling services on top of it. You're supporting people. You're training. You're integrating, etc. Wipro, we're a system integrator. We build our business on open source because we do development of customer applications based on open source, amongst other things. So for the last part of this presentation, and I'm going to leave some time for questions in the end, we're going to look at some examples of business models that work well with open source, and I'm going to give some corporate examples of companies who've implemented these business models. So I want you to keep in mind that those are not the only business models, and in many cases people have a lot more imagination than I do, and will invent business models that could be based on these, combining these, and doing some crazy things that still end up generating money. Okay, so the first one is develop a revenue-bearing service using open source software. So in this case, you're not necessarily developing open source, but you're using it, you're packaging it in your data center, and you're selling a service. That could be Amazon Web Services, you're making this available. It could be Netflix, you're making videos available to people, and people are paying not for the open source software, but for the service, running in the cloud some software of theirs, or viewing videos and movie. So that's one great way of making money off of open source. Thing is, you can be perceived negatively if you're not contributing back to the open source. So if you're going to be using this model, I encourage you to become a strong contributor to the projects you're using because it works well for your corporate image, okay? It sends the message that you're a community player and that not only are you consuming the open source, but you're making it better as well, making it better for you and for the community. Another model is generate services revenue from open source integration or open source support. This is typically where people like Wipro work, okay? It's basically saying, we have something that is based on open source, or we provide something that is based on open source, and what we're going to sell is actually services on this. Not selling like the data services, but really integration, training, support. And that's one of the beauties of open source, by the way. You don't necessarily have to get your support from the vendor of the product, in particular if the vendor is not in the region. You can get your support from a third-party company if they have knowledge enough. If you look at Cassandra, it's a great distributed database. It's developed by the Apache Foundation, which doesn't have a charter to provide service and support. They just developed the software. But one of the companies who contributes to it is DataStax. And DataStax sells support. So if you want support for the open source product Cassandra, you can go to DataStax and they will support you for a fee. Okay. There is another model which is interesting. The idea here is to use open source to reduce the actual cost of a system. So instead of developing in-house, you're going to integrate components inside systems you sell. The examples here are Cisco, Samsung, obviously Linksys as well. All of the home-based Wi-Fi routers like Asus all use the same principle. Inside the hardware, rather than have developed their own operating system, they use an open source Linux kernel or an open source platform. The web interface for administration is using an open source web server. The libraries for encryption are open source, etc. So they're using these open source components in order to lower the manufacturing cost of their product, and they make these products available to you at a much more reasonable cost than if they had to develop everything in-house. These companies have started to learn over time that this model works well if they contribute back. And if they publish their source code. As I said, Linksys was hurt really bad because initially they didn't publish the source code, and when people found out that it was Linux inside, it became really nasty and it went to lawyers and they had to publish the code. Some companies basically find a business model by saying, we will make available to you a community edition of the project that you're using for free. But with this community edition, you get no support. And if you want to get patches, you have to install them yourself or you have to upgrade to the next release. But we will provide a commercial version of the product. It's often called an enterprise version because everybody agrees on that term. And that enterprise version is going to be available for a cost, and it can be a one-time cost. It can be, typically, it's more of a subscription cost. For as long as you pay the subscription, you will get access to live updates, you will get access to support, you will get access to new releases, and basically it guarantees that you always have something that is in perfect working condition. This is even more interesting for a company like MongoDB because the community version of MongoDB comes with a license called the Affero GPL. By the way, they've recently announced that the newer releases come with a new license, which is called the Server-Side Public License, which is a license that MongoDB created. And this license is a viral license like the normal GPL, but it applies to services over the web. So it means that if you build a web application based on MongoDB and you offer it over the internet to your customers, all of your application code, in addition to MongoDB, must come with a similar open source license. And this can be painful for people who don't want to share that code, so they can purchase from MongoDB a commercial license, which doesn't have that obligation. So if you're using MongoDB and you want to provide an application for which you don't want to share your source code, you have to pay for the enterprise version of MongoDB, okay? Red Hat has a similar model. You can download Red Hat for free, but if you're going to use it in production and you want to have updates and support, you pay for the subscription of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, okay? That doesn't mean Red Hat cannot be used for free. You can download Red Hat for free, but if you want support, you have to pay. You can also use the complete community edition, CentOS, if you don't care about support at all and just want to work with the community. Okay, another model is to have revenue from enhanced commercial upgrades. So this is often called freemium or open core. The idea is you have an open source product, which is free. It's a community product, but it doesn't do everything. It maybe is enough for standard community users or for small type of deployments. But if you want to use enterprise features like monitoring or distributed servers or multiple, in the case of MySQL, very fancy data stores, you have to get the enterprise extensions for it. And the enterprise extensions will come at a cost. So the business model is to say, the basic product is free, but if you want enterprise features, we will bill you for those and make money on those. And by the way, they will come with support and all these kind of nice things. So that's a model that is tricky to implement because it can generate a negative feeling from your users who feel you're trying to cheat them out of the community version. And so if you're going to go for this model, I strongly encourage you to make sure that the community edition is still usable. Okay? Because if your community edition is just there something to look nice and say, we have a community edition, but basically you can't do anything with it, the end result is you'll look bad. So think about this. If you're going to implement one of these, a product with one of these models, make sure your community edition makes sense. In the case of MySQL, it's an interesting story because MySQL was free. Oracle acquired Sun, which had MySQL. Oracle moved out of MySQL Community Edition some of the interesting features. And now the Community Edition is extremely limited into what you can do. You can still run a database on it, but you can't multi-thread, multi-kernel. You can't really use any kind of other file systems than the sequential access. And the result is that it's created a negative feeling because everybody thinks that Oracle is just trying to rip money out of people by forcing them to use Enterprise Edition. It has prompted the creation of a project called MariaDB, which uses the Community Edition of MySQL and adds to it, by default, all of the missing enterprise class features. So MariaDB is basically a MySQL. It's a fork. Every time there's a new MySQL, MariaDB forks it and creates MariaDB, but with all of the missing features. And so people tend to look at MariaDB if they want a community version of MySQL that can be used for some really useful stuff, which ends up being not that good for Oracle in the end. So make sure you select the right kind of feature you're going to put in your open source core if you go for one of these models. Okay. When I said some of these business models have combinations, Red Hat is an example where you can sell a product package that comes with support and maintenance. The idea here is that they're going to sell a subscription model. Okay, nobody wants to run enterprise mission-critical software without a very, very strong support story, because if right before the holiday sales season your system, your online shop breaks down, every hour of stopped service represents potential millions of dollars or euros or whatever lost. So you want to have instant mission-critical support. Okay, just a few more and then I'm done. Another one is not really monetizing open source itself, but making sure you use open source for your visibility. I love one example, which is Novartis. They're a pharmaceutical company. They normally don't share much data, but they have a website where they publish DNA sequencing code, really fancy stuff. And nobody's contributing to it. They're not selling it. They're just showing off what they can do. And that's generating visibility and encouraging people to use them to develop drugs and things like that. Okay. This one, how do you help change things? How do you move from a boring, if you want, market, and you can leverage your open source story and help build new ways, new dynamics by playing with your business models. There are companies who've moved to open source to generate open innovation stories. Allianz has open source code for their insurance backbone, and they're saying, we want our competitors to play with this stuff. We want our competitors to use the software, and we want our competitors to contribute code to it. So it's very interesting. You can use open source to completely shift the dynamics of the market you're in, and turn your competition into potential co-innovators or contributors to extensions of your software. Okay. The slides will be available, I hope, so I'm not going to read the details, but one thing that is really important, when you go on an open source project, it's the same thing as when you go on any project. Before you do anything, think and put in place a strategy. You know, what do you want to do? What are you going to get out of it? And it's the same thing when it comes to open source strategy. Why are you doing open source? If you're doing open source to save money, believe me, it's a wrong story. It doesn't work well. You're going to spend money on integration, on support, on other things. if you do open source to drive market adoption, to foster innovation, to drive ecosystem dynamics, to drive talent acquisition and retention, those are great stories and they play long and they work well. So think of your strategy, whether you're creating a company or you're going to use open source in your company, why are you going to do this? And because I'm out of time, I'm going to stop here, but maybe we have time for a couple of questions. Do we?